We will continue the reading of Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation, Chapter 1, and we were on Part 2. We're just beginning. Part 2. None of us can ever retrieve that innocence before all theory when art knew no need to justify itself. When one did not ask of a work of art what it said because one knew or thought one knew what it did. From now to the end of consciousness, we are stuck with the task of defending art. We can only quarrel with one or another means of defense. Indeed, we have an obligation to overthrow any means of defending and justifying art which becomes particularly obtuse or onerous or insensitive to contemporary needs and practice. This is the case today with the very idea of content itself. Whatever may have been in the past, the idea of content is today mainly a hindrance, a nuisance, a subtle or not so subtle Philistinism. Though the actual developments in many arts may seem to be leading Though the actual developments in many arts may seem to be leading us away from the idea that a work of art is primarily its content, the idea still exerts an extraordinary hegemony. I want to suggest that this is because the idea is now perpetuated in the guise of a certain way of encountering works of art, thoroughly ingrained among most people who take any of the arts seriously. What the overemphasis on the idea of content entails is the perennial, never consummated project of interpretation. And conversely, it is the habit of approaching works of art in order to interpret them, that sustains the fancy that there really is such a thing as the content of a work of art. Now, this is very interesting reading about Susan Sontag. When we are reading and meditating on what we read, this is a kind of interpretation. And nevertheless, Susan tells us that we must be attentive, aware. Maybe if interpreting is kind of a trap, or maybe that interpretation is a personal view and not necessarily the general view or the totality of a view. But, like it or not, we interpret many things in our lives. But we are continuing to read Susan Sontag's readings. Now, I'm going to read number 3. And she is going to address what we were commenting just a few seconds ago. 3. Of course, I don't mean interpretation in the broadest sense, the sense in which Nietzsche rightly says, there are no facts, only interpretations. By interpretation, I mean here a conscious act of the mind which illustrates a certain code, certain rules of interpretation. Directed to art, interpretation means plucking a set of elements, the X, the Y, the Z, and so forth, from the whole work. The task of interpretation is virtually one of translation. The interpreter says, look, don't you see that X is really or really means A, that Y is really B, that Z is really C? What situation could prompt this curious project of transforming a text? History gives us the materials for an answer. Interpretation first appears in the culture of late classical antiquity. When the power of credibility of myth had been broken by the realistic view of the world introduced by scientific enlightenment. Once the question that haunts post-mythic consciousness, that of the seemliness of religious symbols, had been asked, the ancient texts were, in their pristine form, no longer acceptable. Then interpretation was summoned to reconcile the ancient text to modern demands. Thus, the Stoics, to accord with the view that the gods had to be moral, allegorized away the rude features of Zeus and his boisterous clan in Homer's epics. What Homer really designated by the adultery of Zeus with Leto, they explained, was the union between power and wisdom. In the same vein, Philo of Alexandria interpreted the literal historical narratives of the Hebrew Bible as spiritual paradigm. The story of the Exodus from Egypt, the wandering in the desert for 40 years, and the entry into the promised land, said Philo, was really an allegory of the individual soul's emancipation, tribulations, and final deliverance. Interpretation, thus, presupposes a discrepancy between the clear meaning of the text and the demands of later readers. It seeks to resolve that discrepancy. The situation is that for some reason the text has become unacceptable, yet it cannot be discarded. Interpretation is a radical strategy for conserving an old text, which is thought too precious to repudiate or revamping it. The interpreter, without actually erasing or rewriting the text, is altering it. But he can't admit to doing this. He claims to be only making it intelligible by disclosing its true meaning. However far the interpreters alter the text, another notorious example is the rabbinic and Christian spiritual interpretations of the clearly erotic Song of Songs. They must claim to be reading off a sense that is already there. Interpretation in our own time, however, is more complex. For the contemporary zeal of the project of interpretation is often prompted not by piety toward the troublesome text, which may conceal an aggression, but by an open aggressiveness and overt contempt of appearances. The old style of interpretation was insistent but respectful. It erected another meaning on top of the literal one. The modern style of interpretation excavates, and as it excavates, destroys. It digs behind the text to find a subtext, which is the true one. The most celebrated and influential modern doctrines, those of Marx and Freud, actually amount to elaborate systems of hermeneutics aggressive and impious theories of interpretation. All observable phenomena are bracketed in Freud's phrase as manifest content or manifest content. This manifest content must be probed and pushed aside to find the true meaning, the latent content beneath. For Marx, social events like revolutions and wars. For Freud, the events of individual lives, like neurotic symptoms and slips of the tongue, as well as texts, like a dream or a work of art. All are treated as occasions of interpretation. According to Marx and Freud, these events only seem to be intelligible. Actually, they have no meaning without interpretation. To understand is to interpret. To understand is to interpret. And to interpret is to restate the phenomenon, in effect to find an equivalent for it. Thus, interpretation is not, as most people assume, an absolute value, a gesture of mind situated in some timeless realm of capabilities. Interpretation must itself be evaluated within a historical view of human consciousness. In some cultural contexts, interpretation is a liberating act. It is a means of revising, of transvaluing, of escaping the dead past. In other cultural contexts, it is reactionary, impertinent, cowardly, stifling. End of number 2 and 3. We will continue. Thank you very much.